All right, well, I've just finished this book, A Thousand Splendid Suns, by the same guy who wrote The Kite Runner. And I guess I didn't like it. I feel complicated about this book because I really, really liked part one. I enjoyed part one quite a bit. But as the book went on, it just started to become more and more of a drag until I was just not as interested. Um, And I want to go into the reasons that I didn't quite like this book because it's on the surface it's very very similar to another book that I did like, which is A Fine Balance by Rohinton Minstry, one of my favorite books. A book that was so good it caused me to start doing these little vlogs about the books that I read. So this book is pretty similar, and I guess I should go into that a little bit. It's also a sort of historical fiction novel. It's set in a time and a place that will be unfamiliar to most of the readers. And part of the goal of the book, I guess, is to make us feel like we've been there in some sense, like we've met some of the people from that place. And that place is Afghanistan before the War on Terror. So it chronicles the lives of several characters who lived through the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan into the period that we're in now, the early part of the War on Terror. And I would say, in the abstract, I am very enthusiastic about this book, and I really did like the first parts of it. So it starts out by introducing us to a character named Miriam, whose world is very, very small. She is a bastard. She was born out of wedlock, and this is something that is very, very shameful for not shameful for her. Like she doesn't really feel ashamed, but it's like shameful in her culture, I guess. And her father doesn't want her around, so he has her basically exiled to this tiny little hut where she is raised by her mother, whose sole responsibility seems to be raising her. The mother isn't there for very long because, okay, like spoilers ahead, because she commits suicide, and once Miriam is left without this protector of her mother, her life rapidly deteriorates. She is not accepted into the family of her father. She's instead hastily married off to some random schmuck. The random schmuck turns out to have very, very conservative ideas about what it means to be married to her, and her life deteriorates from there. So it's a really interesting story, one that I am was fascinated by. Like that part of the book, I couldn't get enough of it. I think I read part one in like a couple of days because I just couldn't stop turning the pages. Okay, and then we get to part two, and I was so excited. I was so excited to turn the page. I was like, oh, part two. Super super jazzed to move forward from here. And in part two, we pivot to another character who is also a woman growing up in Afghanistan, and her name is Layla. And Layla is raised in much more fortuitous circumstances. She's in a middle class family. She has been taught much less conservative ideas about what it means to be a woman growing up in Afghanistan. She's like just recognizably she's like just some kid. Like she is comes across as much more being much more similar to stories that we would be familiar with, much more similar to childhoods that we would be familiar with. And okay, to some extent, this is like a breath of fresh air after Miriam's story. But the problem is that, like, I don't know, it's just not as interesting. It's more similar to what I went through in my own childhood, which makes it less interesting, which makes me just like not have as much appetite for this type of thing. Like the whole time I was reading Layla's part of the story, I was like, when, dear God, when are we getting back to Miriam? Please tell me that there's a part of this book where we just go back to being in Miriam's point of view. And after the section, so there's four parts, and after the second part, which is from Layla's perspective, it's Layla and Miriam, and we switch back and forth between their perspectives. And it just, I don't know, the magic was just gone. Like part one was impeccable, it was amazing. I strongly recommend reading part one. Parts two, three, and four, I don't know, maybe just stop reading after part one. And I feel a little conflicted having that be my opinion because I can see pretty clearly why the author felt the need like wanted to write the book in this way, which is similar to the decisions that are made in A Fine Balance. So in A Fine Balance, we also have multiple characters, multiple points of view. We've got 4 characters, and they all come together. Um, and they have very different points of view, very different backgrounds, and it gives us more of a perspective on the time. We see the world from multiple different perspectives, which I would say gives us a more thorough understanding of the period. So that's one reason to do this. And I think that what's his last name? Husseini wants to give us the perspective of Layla because he doesn't want us to think that presumably for many of his readers, this is going to be their only experience of Afghanistan, is reading this book and watching Afghanistan on the news. And he doesn't want us to think that Afghanistan is a land where women live, tragic lives, and that's it. That's the only thing we know about Afghanistan. So he wants to show us that there are women who are more liberated, more like Western women, and who, go to school and have big dreams about what they're going to do in their future. And I completely sympathize with that as an artistic decision, as a way to present the country in a more accurate light. But it's just not as good. It's just not as interesting as the stuff that Miriam goes through. And I haven't really done a close reading of these 2 books to determine why it is that it's just not quite as good. Because the thing is, right, that A Fine Balance does the same thing. It has 2 characters who are desperately poor and 2 characters who are not as poor. And the reason I think that A Fine Balance does a good job here, whereas A Thousand Splendid Suns doesn't do quite as good of a job, is that I don't know. A Fine Balance just gives us more interesting details. It just finds ways to make these people's middle-class lives feel also precarious, if that makes sense. And I think A Thousand Splendid Suns could have done the same thing. I mean, Layla's life is very precarious, and she eventually actually does fall prey to that precarity, which makes it interesting that somehow that precarity just does not add a lot of interest to her story. The fact that things are teetering on the brink, I kind of just don't care that they're teetering on the brink. I want them to teeter over the brink so that maybe we can have a more interesting story. And that eventually does happen. And Husseini manages to make the situation that they fall into be still kind of not that interesting. The book picks up after Layla's life falls apart, but it never reaches the heights of part 1. And so, yeah, I think you can see why I'm conflicted. I mean, on the one hand, I totally sympathize with the artistic ambitions on display here. He wants to show Afghanistan as being a place that is multifaceted and that includes the potential for normal happy lives. He wants to go beyond the headlines. He wants to go beyond the headlines, the stuff that we would know from stereotypes about Afghanistan and seeing the news. But at the same time, that pulls him in the direction of stories that are just not as interesting. And he just doesn't have the sauce to make those stories interesting anyway. And I don't even really mean that as an insult. I mean, you have to be very sauced. You have to be extremely endowed with the sauce in order to be a writer who can write just a normal middle class life in a way that is interesting. And he just doesn't quite succeed. And I think there's some other things that make the end of the story kind of drag on. I, again, want to compare this to A Fine Balance because A Fine Balance does some interesting things where it will develop a metaphor that it returns to and alters over time. So one example in A Fine Balance that I talked about in my video on A Fine Balance is this rug that's being stitched together, right? And the rug is a symbol that he comes back to over and over again. Not rug, it's a quilt. So it's got these different patches on it, and the patches represent different phases in people's lives. And what the rug as a whole represents, the role that it plays in people's lives, changes over time. So at first, it plays the roles of nostalgic memory and sort of hope for the future. Um, and also this way that people like compartmentalize phases of their lives in the same way that a rug has like different sections. Then by the end, although it's the symbol remains one that is like preoccupied with memory, the meaning of the symbol completely changes because the rug becomes like a cushion for a beggar who has no legs, and they push themselves around on like a cart, like a little wheels thing, and the rug is like a cushion for them. So then you see how the metaphor changes over time, and it gains these new layers of meaning, and it means different things at different sections of the book. And A Thousand Splendid Suns is similarly replete with metaphors from everyday life, but the problem is that they're always pulled whole cloth from nothing. Like the metaphor just appears one day, and you're like, okay, there it is. And then that's usually the last time you're going to hear about that metaphor as well. So one example would be a smiley face on the ceiling. Or rather, I don't think the smiley face is really a metaphor. It's more just like a detail. A smiley face on the ceiling, right? And a character notices this smiley face while they're being, once again, big spoilers ahead, while they're being strangled to death. And they notice the smiley face on the ceiling as they are being strangled to death. And that really struck me as an example of how Hosseini doesn't use details in quite the masterful way that Rohinton Minstry does. Because, you know, if this were a detail in a Rohinton Minstry book, this smiley face would have come up 100 pages earlier, and it would have meant something then, and it would mean something different now, and it would have been, you know, referenced back. We would have a whole, like, we would have a whole, like, backlog of things we had already learned about the smiley face. It would have come up before, whereas Hosseini just sort of puts it in there. It's just sort of in the story. It is not mentioned before, and it's never mentioned again. And I think the thing is that a lot of these little details are meant to imply a deep history, because when the smiley face is mentioned, the character that is being strangled, it says that they recognize the smiley face, and it's something, like it's a part of their house, and they've been living in this house for decades. And so the little smiley face on the ceiling is something that they've come to know. It's almost like a part of their body. And so this smiley face has a very deep history, or it's supposed to anyway. But that's very hard to believe when it's appearing from nowhere. This is the first time we're hearing about this detail, and it's also the last time we're hearing about this detail. So Hosseini, I think this is an example. I hate this advice. I hate this bit of advice, but this is an example of show don't tell, where like, or I guess it's sort of a modified version of this, because it's like I want to believe that the smiley face has a history, but in order for that to really ring true, it needs to also have a history in the book. This needs to not be the first time we're ever hearing about this. So yeah, it's details like that that made me think like, okay, this is a pretty good book, but I feel like it's just not quite ringing. And this is a second book. This guy wrote a very famous book called The Kite Runner. Look, it's on the cover. The author of The Kite Runner. And I feel like maybe there was like, I don't know, I'm just speculating here, but maybe there was like less editing than there should have been, or less rewriting than there should have been, because this guy's already proven himself. So yeah, I think that's a good example of the way that details are used poorly. They're not used well. And I think if you're going to tell a story that is about normal everyday life, those kind of normal everyday details are very important. Like they need to feel like they have weight to them, and they also need to feel real. And in this book, they neither feel real nor do they feel like they have weight to them. Another thing is that the dialogue in some places is very I've referred to this before as if dialogue, where the writer knows what they want to say, they know how the conversation wants to go, and then they just sort of write the conversation going that way. And it's not really it doesn't sound like such a bad thing, but it is. Like it's not a conversation unfolding, and it doesn't feel like real people talking to each other and sort of exploring the shared space of the conversation and sort of discovering what's happening as it's happening. It sounds very much like the author was like, and then they say this, and the characters were like, aye, aye, Captain, and then we say that, and then they say the thing, and then the scene is over. And it's very unsatisfying. Um, what else? I feel like this author, there's some really interesting stuff here. I mean, like I said, it's a pretty good book, even though I mostly have negative things to say about it. And what else? There's the use of like non-English words throughout this book. I don't know what language they're from. Maybe like Pashto or something, one of the other languages of Afghanistan. Um, and he uses a lot of non-English words. And at first, that was kind of annoying to me. But he's managed to do it in a way that is remarkably like unobtrusive, which is that whenever he's using one of those words, he always puts it in italics. So you know that it's a word that you're not necessarily supposed to know what it means. And the first time he uses the word, he pretty much always defines it or puts it in a context where you can figure out what it means like pretty easily. So that was cool. It added a sense of sort of like local flavor. Like it made it kind of believe it made it easier to imagine that although I'm reading the dialogue in English, these people aren't actually speaking English to each other. And there's a moment actually in the book that's really interesting there where the characters are like watching something on TV, and someone like a peripheral character who was introduced like 1 page ago has to translate it for them because it's in English and none of them speak any English, which is amazing. Like it was just such a weird moment of being like, oh yeah, even though I'm reading this book in English, not a single one of the named characters, like except for this like random translator, not a single one of these characters actually like speaks English. It's not a part of their lives, which is interesting because multilingualism is like a pretty big aspect in the book. Um, okay, I feel like I've been very critical. Maybe I should say some of the things that I did like. I think that the the book expresses a certain type of how do I put this pain and suffering very well, and I think it's the type of pain and suffering that Miriam goes through. The first character, the viewpoint character for part one, and that is suffering that originates from despair, and it's a kind of despair where like even hope just sort of stokes on the suffering. Really well written. I wish the whole book had just been about that. In contrast, I think Husseini is not quite as good at expressing suffering that comes from just like straight up really bad shit happening to someone. Um, and I don't know. I think it's hard to be good at that. Yeah, there are some plot points that feel a little goofy. Um, hmm. There are some plot points that feel a little goofy, and it also like one thing he doesn't do a great job of conveying, and at this point I'm really nitpicking because this is hard to convey. This is really hard to get right in a book, is that in this setting, there's supposed to be a lot of like random violence, right? Like the violence is supposed to be really like random and shocking. And it just doesn't feel that way. Like there are characters who just get blown up by like stray rockets and stuff like that, as happens sometimes in war. Um, and it feels like the culmination of their arc as a character that they get blown up by a rocket, which sort of undercuts the credibility of this idea that any of these characters could just be killed at any time. Because it doesn't really happen. Like, okay, like, okay, this is hard. This is kind of hard to explain. It's a little bit abstract, but the character's life is cut short, but the character's arc is not cut short. The character goes on their character arc, they get to the end, and then they are killed by a stray rocket, and it feels like the culmination of an arc, which undercuts the idea that this violence is like can happen to anyone at any time. And I think this is, once again, my example of how you do this right comes from Rohinton Minstry's A Fine Balance, where he has the backstory of his two poor characters. For like 100 pages, we're going into the backstory of these characters. And it feels like there is an arc that they're all going on. Like all of these characters, the backstory of this, entire family. It feels like they're going on an arc. There's a very clearly defined arc,
And if I had to express what I think the end of that arc would be, it would be sort of assertion of dignity despite being an untouchable, right? So these characters are going on this arc, and then maybe like 70% of the way through the arc, it is completely cut short by a random and extremely brutal act of violence. Random is not quite the right word. It's not random, it's like planned by the community. But it cuts short their arc, which makes the violence feel disruptive because it's not just disrupting the lives of the characters, it is also disrupting the arc that I'm reading. Like, I felt like this story was going somewhere other than, and then they all fucking die. And then they all fucking die. And so it feels disruptive to me as a reader, and those emotions I think carry through to how I feel about the situation. Whereas okay, what happens in A Thousand Splendid Suns is that Layla and her family are planning to leave Afghanistan, and then right as they finally planned to leave Afghanistan, their house is hit by a rocket, and Layla's parents are both killed. And you know, obviously, in the way that I have described it, it is a huge disruption to their lives. But as a reader, I could kind of tell that something bad was coming next. Like, I didn't actually think that these characters were just gonna like leave. I thought that something would stop them. I mean, it just felt like too much of a positive turn. It felt like too much of a happy, and then the conflict is over type of thing for it to actually happen. And I really did not think these characters were getting out of Afghanistan. I didn't have a clear idea of how they would be stopped, but I knew that something was coming to prevent them from leaving Afghanistan. And so when it's a rocket, I'm not really surprised. And it doesn't, I mean, even though I can clearly see that it's a disruption to the characters' lives, it's not really a disruption to me as a reader. It's more like I knew something bad was happening, and it turns out that bad thing is a rocket. So yeah, A Thousand Splendid Suns. I feel pretty ambivalent about this book because, like I said, part one very good, but it's just not great. It's a 4-star book that should have been like 100, maybe 150 pages shorter, and I just have a really hard time recommending a book that by the end of it you will just be sick of it and you'll want to put it down. And that's exactly how I felt by the end of this book. I really thought that it should have ended way sooner. I think the parts of the book after like part one could have been condensed by a lot, and I think the book would be all the better for it. Um, yeah, I think there's another example like right near the end of where Husseini doesn't quite manage to get his sort of political, like artistico political ambitions and goals to really square with um, the way, like the book being good. So at the end of the book, so there's like this character, Miriam, and she has a father who, had her out of wedlock, and he, when he's young, like 40 years old, is very ashamed of her existence, and so he doesn't claim her as a daughter. But then when he gets older, he regrets this decision, and he tries to have a relationship with his daughter, and it doesn't work because Miriam's life has been destroyed by his decision not to claim her as a daughter, and she's not interested in forgiving him or even talking to him. And then he dies, and Miriam doesn't even find out that he died until much later. And he tried to give her this letter. The last time he tried to reconnect with her, like she wouldn't even let him in the house, and he gave her this letter, and she shredded the letter. And at the end of the book, we find that there's a copy of the letter, and it's Layla who's going through the stuff and reading this letter. And Layla doesn't have a huge amount of like context for all of this, I imagine, but we as the reader do. And the letter is very touching. It's a high point in the back half of the book, reading this letter, where he basically goes through all of his mistakes. He writes a very heartfelt apology. It feels like the kind of like up note that you actually can end this book on, you know? It would feel very hollow if the up note that you ended it on was like, and then everybody was actually like permanently and enduringly happy. Uh, but ending it on this sort of like ambiguous like, and then this guy was very sorry. You know, it's a bittersweet feeling, and that felt to me like a really appropriate place to end the book. And then the book just fucking doesn't end. It keeps going. We snap back to our less interesting viewpoint character, Layla, who it says like, oh, and then Layla cried and she went home and her husband comforted her, which is like, okay, great. I didn't need that. And then there's another chapter or two about how Layla begins a school where young girls are able to learn in that school. And it's a super boring chapter, but I think it's a great example of Hosseini's like artistico political goals. Like he wants to present this other side of Afghanistan as a place where women and girls can have a future, and that's what he dedicates his last chapter to. And politically, I'm very sympathetic to that, but that doesn't stop that chapter from kind of sucking. It doesn't stop that chapter from just straight up being sort of a drag. It's like, okay, we just blew past the perfect ending for this novel, and now we're gonna read about 1,000 more words about like, and then Layla has a school, and the school's really great, and the kids are like, oh, we want to learn, and she's like, we're gonna learn. So yeah, and I also I feel like kind of an asshole for even saying that stuff because it's like obviously I super duper agree with the impulse behind having that be the last chapter, but it doesn't stop that chapter from actually being bad. Okay, great. 1,000 Splendid Suns, very very sad book. It will make you sad both because of the things that happen and because the book is almost 400 pages long and it should have been about 250 pages long instead. Okay, that is my very mixed review. Bye bye.